I'd spent my life listening to the whispers of the wild, but that day, in the deep Absaroka woods, the whispers weren't from the wind. They were calling, luring me into a silence more profound and ancient than any hunter should ever know. The air had that sharp, metallic bite to it, the kind that tells you winter isn't just coming, it's already got one foot in the door. The forest floor was a graveyard of last month's color, all rust and brown, and every step I took crackled like I was walking on a bed of bones. I'd been tracking a 10-point buck since sunrise, a real ghost of the woods. He was smart, leading me in wide, looping circles deeper into the Absaroka range, far from any trail I recognized. But I was patient. Hunting isn't about the kill, not really. It's about the silence, the focus, the world shrinking down to just you, the wind, and the track in front of you. My granddad taught me these woods. He'd say, "Cole, you gotta listen with more than your ears. The forest is always talking. You just gotta learn the language." And for the better part of 30 years, I'd been a fluent speaker. I knew the chitter of a squirrel, warning of a predator, the low groan of a pine, heavy with snow, the whisper of the wind through a narrow gorge. That's why I froze when I first heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. I was crouched behind a granite boulder the size of my truck, my breath pluming in the cold air, rifle resting easy in my arms. The buck's tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp earth. He was close. My heart was doing a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. And then, carried on a sudden gust of wind, I heard it. A murmur. It was faint, like a radio playing in a distant house. I slowly lowered my rifle and tilted my head, straining to listen. The wind died down, and the sound was gone. I shook my head, chiding myself. Nerves. It was just the wind, playing tricks on me. Granddad used to say the wind in the canyons could sound like people talking if you listened long enough. I refocused, scanned the thicket of aspens ahead. Nothing. I took another slow, deliberate step, my boots making almost no sound on the leaf litter. And there it was again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. This was a voice, or voices. Plural. It was a soft, sibilant whispering, impossible to make out any distinct words, but the cadence was unmistakable. It sounded like a hushed, urgent conversation. A cold dread, completely alien to me in these familiar woods, slithered up my spine. My first thought was other hunters. But no hunter whispers like that. You either stay silent, or you talk in a normal voice. This was secretive. I crouched lower, every sense on high alert. The buck was forgotten. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from tree to tree, rock to rock. The whispering seemed to be coming from my left, from a sheer rock face about 50 yards away. It was a jumble of ancient, moss-covered granite, a place where you could easily twist an ankle or run into a hibernating bear. I'd never had a reason to explore it closely. The whispers rose and fell, weaving in and out of the sound of the wind, and the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. There was a strange quality to it, a thin, reedy sound, almost like a child trying to imitate an adult's voice. My logical mind was racing, trying to find an explanation. Lost hikers? A couple who'd wandered off trail? But why would they be hiding and whispering? My hand tightened on the cold steel of my rifle. I wasn't a man who spooked easily. I'd faced down a grizzly sow and stared a mountain lion in the eye. But this was different. This was a puzzle that my wilderness-trained brain couldn't solve, and the unknown is always the most terrifying predator. I decided I couldn't just leave it. What if someone was hurt? What if a child was lost? The thought spurred me into action. I moved with a practiced quiet, flanking the source of the sound, using the trees and boulders for cover. As I got closer, the whispering became clearer, though the words remained a frustrating, overlapping jumble. It was like listening to a dozen people all whispering at once, their voices tangling into a meaningless chord of sound. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. There was no way there were a dozen people hiding in these rocks. I finally reached the edge of the rock face. The whispering was loud now, seeming to emanate directly from a dark fissure in the stone, an opening I'd never noticed before. It was partially obscured by a thick growth of wild currant bushes, their bare, thorny branches like a skeletal hand guarding the entrance. A cave. It wasn't large, maybe 4 feet high and a couple of feet wide. A black, uninviting mouth in the side of the mountain, and the whispers were pouring out of it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. "Is anyone in there? Do you need help?" The whispering stopped. Instantly. The silence that fell was so abrupt and so absolute it was more shocking than the sound itself. It was like a switch had been flipped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood there for a long minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Not a sound. "I'm a hunter," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening. "I heard voices. Is everyone okay?" More silence. The heavy, waiting kind. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening back. I took a hesitant step closer to the cave mouth. A blast of cold air, much colder than the autumn afternoon, washed over me. It carried a strange smell, damp earth, wet stone, and something else. Something faintly sweet and cloying, like old flowers left to rot. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Every instinct my granddad had ever honed in me was screaming, a silent primal alarm bell in my gut. Leave. Now. Forget the buck. Forget the voices. Just walk away and don't look back. But I couldn't. The thought of a child, hurt and scared, trapped in that darkness. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I just walked away. I unslung the powerful LED flashlight from my pack, its aluminum body cold in my hand. I flicked it on, the bright white beam cutting a sharp cone into the gloom. "I'm coming in," I announced, more to bolster my own courage than for anyone who might be inside. "Don't be afraid." I pushed aside the brittle branches of the currant bush, their thorns snagging at my jacket. I ducked my head and stepped over the threshold, moving from the gray afternoon light into a profound and utter blackness. The moment my boots touched the cave floor, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The air was thick, still, and dead. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a small, natural chamber. It was completely empty. The walls were smooth, damp, stone. The floor was packed earth. There were no footprints, no discarded gear, no sign that any human being had ever set foot in here. It was just a hollow space in the rock. There was nowhere to hide, no other passages leading off. It was just empty. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me feel dizzy. It was the wind. It had to be. A freak acoustic effect, the wind whistling through the fissure creating a sound that my mind, tired from the long day's hunt, had twisted into voices. I let out a shaky breath, a short, humorless laugh escaping my lips. I felt like an idiot, standing here with my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest over a trick of the wind. I swept the flashlight beam around one last time, just to be sure, letting the light play over the barren floor, the curving walls, the low ceiling. My granddad's voice echoed in my head. The forest is always talking. Yeah, and sometimes it just spouts nonsense. I was about to back out into the fading daylight when my beam of light fell on something. In the exact center of the cave, sitting perfectly upright on a flat, clean section of the floor, was a small, carved wooden soldier. It was old, the kind of toy my grandfather might have played with as a boy. It was painted in a smart blue coat with a tall black hat, its tiny face a simple, expressionless mask. There was not a speck of dust on it, not a single cobweb. Its paint wasn't faded or chipped. The blue was vibrant, its tiny black eyes seeming to stare right back into the beam of my light, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the very marrow in my bones, that it hadn't been there when I first swept the light across the empty floor. My blood went cold. Not the chill of the cave, but a deep, internal freeze that started in my stomach and spread through my veins like ice water. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I hadn't just missed it. The floor had been bare. I had swept the beam over that exact spot. I was a hunter. My life, my success, My safety depended on my ability to see what others miss. The flick of an ear in the brush, the unnatural line of a tine against a tree trunk, a patch of dirt that is slightly more disturbed than the dirt next to it. I didn't miss things, especially not a brightly painted soldier sitting bolt upright in the dead center of an empty room. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The soldier just sat there, impassive. It was maybe 6 inches tall, carved with a simple, rustic charm, but the paint was perfect. The blue of its coat was a deep, royal blue. The red stripes on its trousers were crisp and sharp. And its face, 2 black dots for eyes, a small red slit for a mouth, painted in a placid, almost cheerful expression that felt monstrously out of place in the crushing silence of this rock tomb. My brain, desperate for a rational explanation, offered up possibilities, each one more ludicrous than the last. Had it fallen from the ceiling? I swept the light up. Solid rock, dripping with condensation. No cracks, no holes. Had it been pushed up from the floor? The packed earth was undisturbed. It was as if it had simply materialized, popped into existence between one sweep of my light and the next. Slowly, deliberately, I forced my legs to move. I took a step into the cave, and another. My boots made no sound on the damp floor. The air was so still I could hear the thrumming of blood in my own ears. The sweet, rotting smell was stronger now, thick in the back of my throat. I stopped a few feet from the soldier. It looked so innocent, a child's toy. That thought was somehow the most terrifying of all. Where was the child who owned it? I crouched down, balancing on the balls of my feet, my rifle still held tight in one hand, the flashlight in the other. I leaned in closer, studying it. The wood was dark and heavy-looking, maybe oak. The craftsmanship was detailed, but there were no maker's marks, no initials carved into its base. It was just a perfect, anonymous little man. How was it standing so perfectly? Its base was tiny, the ground wasn't perfectly level. It should have toppled over. Yet it stood there as if rooted to the spot. Against my better judgment, against every primal scream of my instincts, I reached out a hesitant, gloved finger to touch it. I had to know if it was real. I had to know if I was losing my mind. My finger was an inch away, then a half inch, the tip almost grazing the top of its tall, black hat. And then the whispering started again. It wasn't a murmur from the mouth of the cave this time. It was directly in my ear. A dry, sibilant hiss that was so close it felt like it was inside my head. It was one voice, thin and reedy, and it spoke a single, perfectly clear word. Mine. I jerked back so fast I stumbled, falling backward onto the cold, hard ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, skittering across the floor and slamming into the far wall. The bulb flickered once, twice, and then went out. Plunging, absolute darkness. A blackness so complete it was a physical presence. It pressed against my eyes, filled my lungs. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I was blind. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed into my chest. I scrambled on the floor, my hands patting the damp earth, searching for the flashlight. My fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. The aluminum casing. Relief washed over me. I grabbed it, shook it, smacked it against the palm of my other hand. Nothing. I clicked the switch again and again. Nothing. The bulb must have broken, and the whispering was all around me now. It wasn't just in my ear anymore. It was coming from every direction at once, a chorus of those thin, reedy voices, overlapping, echoing in the small chamber. The words were still indistinct, a meaningless babble, but the tone was clear. It was gleeful, mocking. It was the sound of children playing a cruel game. "Get out!" I snarled, my voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the whispering. I pushed myself to my feet, my back hitting the cold, wet stone of the cave wall. "Who's there? Show yourself!" The whispering intensified, the pitch rising, sounding like 1,000 tiny insects chittering in the dark. I could feel it vibrating through the rock against my spine. This wasn't a trick of the wind. This wasn't my imagination. This was real, and I was trapped in the dark with it. My granddad's words came back to me, not as a comfort, but as a dire warning. Listen with more than your ears, Cole. My skin was crawling. I could feel the presence of things in the darkness with me, a sense of being watched by a multitude of unseen eyes. I had my rifle, but what good was a rifle against whispers? What could I possibly shoot at in this suffocating blackness? Survival instinct finally took over, a pure animal need to get to the light. I turned, keeping my shoulder pressed against the wall, and started shuffling toward where I knew the entrance had to be. One step, then another. The whispering followed me, swirling around my head like a cloud of phantom wasps. I could feel the temperature dropping even further, a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to suck the heat right out of my body. My breath was coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Just a few more feet. I could almost feel the cool afternoon air on my face. I would burst out of this damned hole and I would run. I wouldn't stop running until I was back at my truck. And I would never, ever come back to this part of the mountain again. My outstretched hand, searching for the edge of the opening, the rough frame of the cave mouth, hit something solid. It wasn't the edge. It was a flat, unbroken wall of rock. I stopped, confused. I must have gotten turned around in the dark. I shuffled to my left, my hand sliding along the damp, slick stone. Wall. I shuffled to my right. More wall. Panic began to claw its way up my throat, choking me. No. No. It was right here. I was standing right where the entrance was. I knew it. I could picture it in my mind. The currant bushes, the gray light, the world outside. I lunged forward, both hands slapping against the stone. It was solid, unyielding. I banged on it with my fist, the sound a dull, fleshy thud that was swallowed by the whispering. I banged again, harder, screaming now, my voice raw with terror. There was nothing. No opening. No fissure. No crack of daylight. No exit. I spun around, frantically patting the walls of my small prison, my hands mapping out the contours of the chamber. It was a complete, sealed space. The entrance I had walked through not 5 minutes ago was gone. It had vanished. Where the opening to the forest had been, there was only cold, solid stone. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entrance was gone. It wasn't just blocked. It felt like it had never been there at all. The rock under my desperate, scrabbling fingers was seamless, ancient, as if it had been part of the mountain since the dawn of time. My screams died in my throat, replaced by a strangled gasp for air that wouldn't come. The cave, which had seemed small and confined before, now felt infinitesimally vast and crushingly claustrophobic all at once. I was sealed in, buried alive. The whispering intensified, swirling around me in the pitch black. It was louder now, closer, the sibilant hiss of it brushing against my skin like a dry leaf. The mocking, gleeful tone was gone, replaced by something else, something hungry. It was the sound of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. The sweet, cloying smell of decay was overpowering, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. My mind, shattered by terror, latched onto the only tangible thing I had left, my rifle. I fumbled with it, my numb fingers barely able to work the bolt. I chambered around, the sharp clack-clack of the metal action a small defiant sound against the insidious whispers. It was a useless gesture, I knew. Who was I going to shoot? But the familiar weight of the weapon, the solid feel of the checkered stock against my cheek, was a tiny anchor in a sea of madness. "What do you want?" I yelled into the darkness, my voice cracking. The whispering stopped. The sudden silence was a physical shock, a vacuum that pulled at my eardrums. I stood rigid, my back pressed against the unyielding stone, rifle pointed into the impenetrable black. Waiting. The silence stretched on for an eternity, thick and heavy with anticipation. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat counting down my last seconds. Then a new sound began. A soft, rhythmic scratching. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the floor, somewhere in the center of the cave. I pictured the little wooden soldier, its tiny hands scraping at the packed earth, and a fresh wave of revulsion and fear washed over me. I slowly lowered the barrel of my rifle towards the sound, my finger trembling on the trigger. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't a small sound anymore. It sounded like dozens of hands, hundreds of fingernails, digging, clawing at the cave floor. The noise filled the chamber, a dry, rasping sound that set my teeth on edge. I could almost feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots. They were digging. Digging for what? Or digging their way out? A faint pale light began to seep into the darkness. It wasn't coming from the walls, but from the floor itself. It was a sickly, phosphorescent green, the color of rot and deep-sea creatures. It emanated from the spot where the scratching was loudest, outlining a series of thin, growing cracks in the packed earth. The whispering started again, no longer a jumble of voices, but a single, coherent chant, spoken in that thin, reedy, childlike tone. "The toy box is open. The toy box is open." Over and over the same phrase, a nursery rhyme from hell. The green light pulsed in time with the chant, growing brighter with each repetition. I could see the floor now, bathed in that ghastly glow. The wooden soldier was gone. In its place the ground was heaving and cracking, breaking apart as if something was pushing its way up from below. "The toy box is open. The toy box is open." My breath hitched in my chest. Toy box? What in God's name was the toy box? I didn't want to know. I raised my rifle, aiming at the pulsing green light, at the source of the scratching and the chanting. My mind screamed at me to shoot, to fire blindly into the ground, to do something, to stop what was happening. But my body was paralyzed, locked in place by a terror so profound it felt like a physical chain. With a final, sickening crunch, a section of the floor collapsed inward, revealing a black, gaping hole. The scratching stopped. The chanting stopped. The green light flared, illuminating the entire cave in its nauseating glow, and from the hole something began to emerge. At first I thought it was a hand, a pale, slender hand with long, spindly fingers. But then another emerged next to it, and another, and another. They weren't hands. They were something else. They were made of the same dark, polished wood as the soldier, jointed like a marionette's limbs. They clawed their way out of the hole, pulling a shape up from the darkness below. It was a doll, a life-sized porcelain doll, with a cracked, smiling face and wide glass eyes that were completely black. Its yellow flaxen hair was matted with dirt, and its frilly lace dress was torn and stained. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its wooden limbs clicking and clacking against the stone as it hauled itself onto the cave floor. It was followed by another, a boy doll in a velvet suit, its cheeks split open in a permanent, horrifying grin. Then another and another. A nightmarish parade of antique toys, all life-sized, all broken in some terrible way. A rocking horse with one cruel, splintered runner. A jack-in-the-box with a leering, rusted metal clown head that lolled on a bent spring. A teddy bear with button eyes and a jagged tear in its chest from which dark, foul-smelling stuffing oozed. They arranged themselves in a semicircle around the hole, their vacant eyes fixed on me. They stood perfectly still, their silence more menacing than any noise. The green light from the hole cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls behind them, making them look like a legion of demons summoned from the earth. This was the source of the whispering. These were the things that had lured me in. My paralysis finally broke. A guttural scream tore from my throat, and I brought the rifle to my shoulder, the sights finding the dead center of the porcelain doll's smiling face. I squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash lit the cave for a split second in a brilliant, blinding orange, and the recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into my shoulder. The doll's head didn't shatter. The bullet struck its porcelain forehead with a loud ping, the sound of a ricochet, and then went whining off into the darkness to smack against the far wall. It didn't even leave a mark. The doll didn't flinch. It just kept staring at me with those empty black eyes, its painted smile seeming to widen. They began to move. All at once they lurched forward, their movements jerky and puppet-like, a macabre, silent advance. The clacking of their wooden joints and the scrape of their feet on the stone was the only sound. They weren't fast, but they were relentless. I worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering another round. I fired again, this time at the boy doll's chest. Another metallic ping. No effect. I fired again and again, emptying the magazine in a frantic, useless barrage of lead and thunder. The bullets ricocheted wildly around the cave, screaming like angry hornets. The dolls just kept coming. I threw the empty rifle at them. It clattered uselessly against the porcelain doll's chest and fell to the floor. I was defenseless. I scrambled backward, pressing myself into the corner of the cave, trying to make myself small. The circle of horrifying toys tightened around me, their broken forms blocking out the green light, their long shadows swallowing me. The porcelain doll was the closest now, its cracked face just inches from mine. It raised one of its slender wooden hands, its movements stiff and deliberate. I could see the intricate ball joints at its wrist and knuckles. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end, the cloying smell of rot and old things filling my senses. I waited for the cold, hard touch of its hand, but it never came. I felt a sudden sharp tug on the collar of my jacket. It pulled me backward, so hard that my head snapped back and hit the stone wall. I cried out in pain and surprise, my eyes flying open. I wasn't in the corner anymore. I was being dragged into the wall. The rock behind me was no longer solid. It was soft, yielding, like cold, wet clay. It was pulling me in, swallowing me whole. The circle of dolls stood and watched, their heads cocked to the side, as if observing a curious insect. The last thing I saw before the rock closed over my face was the porcelain doll's black, glass eyes, and the chilling, undeniable flicker of intelligent, malevolent light deep within them. The world dissolved into a slurry of cold pressure and suffocating darkness. The sensation of being pulled through solid rock was indescribable, a violation of every law of nature. It wasn't like moving through water or mud. It was a grinding, crushing force that seemed to be pulling my very atoms apart and reassembling them on the other side. The air was squeezed from my lungs, and the whispers, which had been outside, were now inside my head, a frantic, ecstatic chorus screaming directly into my consciousness. I thought my skull would split open. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. I was spat out onto a hard, uneven surface, landing in a heap, gasping, my body screaming in protest. I lay there for a moment, the world spinning, my ears ringing with the phantom echoes of the whispers. The air here was different. It was stale, dry, and carried the scent of dust, ancient paper, and something else, cedar. Cautiously, I pushed myself up. My hands weren't on damp cave earth, but on rough splintered wood. I was in a room. It was a small, attic-like space, illuminated by a single, bare bulb hanging from a rafter, casting a weak, yellow light. The walls were unfinished planks of dark, aged wood, and every available surface was covered in them. Toys, hundreds of them. Not the life-sized monstrosities from the cave, but smaller ones, the kind you'd find in an antique shop. There were shelves lined with tin soldiers, their paint faded and chipped. Porcelain dolls with perfect uncracked faces stared out from dusty glass cabinets. Model trains sat motionless on rusted tracks. Puppets with tangled strings hung limp from hooks on the wall. It was a child's bedroom from a forgotten century, a museum of lost playthings. My heart was still hammering, but the immediate primal terror had been replaced by a disorienting confusion. Where was I? I scrambled to my feet and looked around. It was a completely enclosed room. No windows, no doors, just 4 wooden walls, a floor, and a low, raftered ceiling. And in the center of the room, on a small child-sized wooden chair, sat the painted soldier I had first seen in the cave. It was just sitting there, watching me, its simple face unchanging. "What is this place?" I whispered, the words sounding dead in the still air. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer, just the profound silence of the room. I looked back at the wall I'd come through. It was solid wood, just like the others. There was no sign of the cave, no seam or crack to show how I'd entered. I was trapped again in a different, even stranger prison. My eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for anything, a tool, a loose board, a way out. And then I saw it. On a small desk in the corner, beneath a thick layer of dust, was a leather-bound book. It looked like a journal. With a surge of desperate hope, I lunged for it, blowing a cloud of gray dust from its cover. The leather was cracked and dry, but the gold-leaf lettering was still legible. It read, Silas. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. The handwriting was a looping, elegant script, the kind people don't use anymore. The first entry was dated 1888. It was the journal of a man named Elias Thorne, the owner of a local timber mill. He wrote of his son, Silas, a quiet, lonely boy, a boy who didn't play well with others, who preferred the company of his toys to that of other children. Elias had carved the toys himself, pouring all his love for his withdrawn son into the little wooden soldiers and meticulously crafted dolls. But Silas was different. He didn't just play with his toys, he talked to them. And, Elias wrote with a growing sense of dread, he claimed they talked back. I devoured the pages, my horror mounting with each entry. Elias described how Silas would spend hours locked in his attic room, whispering to his collection. The boy claimed his toys were lonely. They were sad because they couldn't move, couldn't play on their own. He said a voice in the woods, a voice from an old cave, had taught him a way to help them, a way to give them life. It required a trade, a soul for a soul. My blood ran cold as I read the final, frantic entries. Elias had followed Silas into the woods one day, to the very cave I had found. He'd watched in horror as his son performed some strange ritual, whispering strange words, offering a drop of his own blood to the darkness within. Elias had tried to stop him, but it was too late. The cave had answered. It had taken the boy's offering. That night Elias was awoken by a sound from the attic, the sound of footsteps, tiny, wooden footsteps. He'd raced upstairs to find the toys moving on their own. They were walking, their little painted faces animated with a malevolent spark. And his son, Silas, was gone. In his place, sitting in his chair, was the painted wooden soldier, its familiar face now holding a terrifying new stillness. Elias realized the horrifying truth. The spirit of the cave, the hungry ancient thing Silas had called the toy maker, hadn't given the toys life. It had given them his sons. It had shattered Silas's soul into 100 pieces and trapped a fragment in each toy, animating them, turning his beloved creations into a prison for his own child. And the toy maker was always hungry for more. It used the toys, the captured fragments of Silas's soul, to lure others to the cave. Their whispers a siren song of a lost child, promising a new soul to add to its collection. I slammed the journal shut, a terrible understanding dawning on me. I wasn't just trapped, I was the next trade. My soul would be shattered, used to animate some new, horrifying toy, while the thing in the cave grew stronger. I looked at the little soldier on the chair. It wasn't just wood and paint. It was a piece of a little boy, a piece of Silas, used as a lure for over 100 years. The whispers I heard, that was him. That was all that was left of him. Rage, pure and hot, burned through my fear. This thing, this toy maker, hadn't just killed a child. It had enslaved him, turning him into a monster's bait for a century. It was an evil that had to be stopped. But how? The journal offered no answers, only a descent into madness and despair. Elias Thorne, it seemed, had simply vanished. His last entry, a barely legible scrawl about trying to put them back in the box. The box. The toy box is open. The words from the cave echoed in my mind. The hole in the floor. Was that the box? A gateway to this thing's prison? I looked around the room again, my hunter's eyes searching not for an exit but for a weakness. Everything here was old, dry wood. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in my mind. I had my lighter. I always carried a Zippo in my pocket, a habit from my younger smoking days. I pulled it out, the worn brass casing cool in my palm. I walked over to the desk and tore a page from Elias's journal. I held the flame of the lighter to the brittle, yellowed paper. It caught instantly, curling into a black ash, the flame hungry and bright. Fire. It was the only weapon I had left. I looked at the soldier on the chair. "Silas," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened to you, but it's time to rest." I set the burning page on the dusty wooden floor. The dry planks smoldered for a second, then caught, a small orange flower of flame blooming in the gloom. I tore out more pages, feeding the fire, which grew rapidly, licking its way up the leg of the desk, its hungry crackle the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to fill the small room. The fire spread with terrifying speed, devouring the ancient tinder-dry wood. It raced across the floor, climbed the walls, setting the shelves of toys ablaze. The room began to scream. It wasn't a human sound, but the high-pitched, agonized shriek of 1,000 tortured voices, all crying out at once. It was the sound of Silas's shattered soul, trapped in the burning toys, finally being released. The porcelain dolls in the cabinet blackened, and their faces cracked in the heat. The puppets on the wall writhed as the flames consumed their strings. The entire room was an inferno, a funeral pyre for a boy lost a century ago. Through the roaring flames and the smoke, I saw the wall behind the now burning chair begin to shimmer, to lose its solidity. The way back. The fire was breaking the toymaker's hold on this place, weakening the prison. I shielded my face with my arm and plunged into the wall of fire, toward the shimmering portal. The heat was immense, searing my skin and scorching my lungs. For a second I was back in that crushing, grinding non-space, but this time it was filled with the cleansing roar of the fire and the final fading screams of the released souls. Then I was on my hands and knees, coughing, vomiting, on the cold, damp earth of the forest floor. I was outside. The gray afternoon light was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I scrambled away from the rock face, turning to look back. There was no cave, no fissure, no currant bush, just a solid wall of granite, as if the cave had never existed. The whispers were gone. The silence of the forest rushed back in, clean and pure and blessedly empty. I lay there for a long time, my body shaking, my face pressed into the cold dirt, just breathing the free air. The buck, the hunt, it was all forgotten. I had stumbled into a story 100 years old, and somehow I had written its final chapter. I don't hunt in that part of the range anymore. Sometimes when the wind is just right, I think I can still smell a faint trace of wood smoke on the breeze, and I know that somewhere a little boy named Silas is finally, truly, at peace.